Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm back in a LinkedIn Live with Dave Human. Welcome, Dave.
Hello, hello, hello. Let's ask some questions. Make them rude ones. Make them harsh
All
ones.
right. How can you be so tall? No, we won't start with that question just yet. If you're joining us from anywhere around the world, please tell us where it's from. But we also want you to promise us that you will give us a tough or sticky or nasty or challenging question that you have received. And we, being the Q&A whisperers, as we promised to be, will try to tackle it and give you strategies on how to approach it. Is that right, Dave?
Yeah, I think, having done this for quite a number of years now, what I see is that people prepare for a presentation or an interview. They figure out what they're going to say, but they quite often forget that there's going to be 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 really nasty questions. If you think about, you're a startup and you're going out for funding. Well, how are you any different? What do you do? Yeah, and the underlying tone is, why do I care? And why would I give you money? Or why should I give you a job? And if you forget to prepare for those questions, that's what people remember. They remember that deer in the headlights look, not the great answer you gave or the great presentation you gave. They remember when you fumbled one of the questions. So it's really a blind spot for a lot of people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you're just joining us from Oklahoma to India and Italy and some other places that I saw, Pakistan, I think, first of all, I want to say thank you. I know your time is valuable. And I also commend you for taking time for continuing education or professional development. Welcome from Sao Paulo, Brazil, one of my favorite places in the world. Last time Dave joined us, it was March, and we were talking about being a rock star presenter. What does it take? And we didn't get to the Q&A portion. Dave Human has a book called Weekend Language. He is, I would say, a presentation whisperer. If he's one, he was just behind the scenes telling me that he's flying to Expedia in London and then heading to Dubai to work with Google. He name drops a lot, but he doesn't do it intentionally. It's true. He does work with a lot of high-level, C-level executives in companies that are Fortune 100 in helping them be concise with their messages and bring a lot of energy. And I love the stories, Dave, that you have and how you tell them with kindness, because quite often they're challenging ones. Someone is with us from Ethiopia. I love that. And there is someone from Ghana, and Shelby is in Tennessee. Hold on strong, Shelby. Dave, anything you want to, beyond sort of you, it's a blind spot, where do you approach things? And then I'll talk a little bit about what's in the newsletter. But what are the things you want people to know about the anxiety that is created with presentations and with Q&A?
I think the number one thing is that it's overcomable. I don't even know if overcomable is a word, but everyone freaks out a little bit when they know they're going to get a really tough question from their boss or from the hiring manager. But with enough practice, with enough prep, with enough thinking, you can really answer probably 95% of the questions that you're going to get asked. There's always the possibility that someone tosses that verbal hand grenade at you and you haven't thought of it. But we're going to talk about some techniques today where you can still remain on your feet, acknowledge that question, parry it, put it over here and come back to it later. Because that kind of stuff can make a huge difference, especially when the stakes are high, when there's money on the table, or when there's a job offer on the table. You want to make sure, but you absolutely can do this. There is no such thing as a naturally gifted answerer of questions. It's absolutely a practiced art.
Practice. And you talking about the verbal hand grenade reminds me to tell everyone, by the way, we have now people from Ireland and from Brazil again, and from Montreal. I was just in Toronto, Singapore, another place I've been to that's amazing. But Dave is a recovering journalist. So that means he can't help himself by coming up with these great lines that I try to write down, but I botch half the time. I try to repeat them. Very entertaining and so true. When someone throws something at you that you're not prepared or haven't practiced for, it's challenging. If you haven't seen it yet, every month I publish a newsletter called Stronger. in a way making you metaphorically stronger to show up in the workplace and perform in a stronger way. And in this one, I always try to tether the topic of the newsletter with the live. I approached the concept of Q&A from a three-pronged an approach that says connect with the audience, inform them, and inspire them. And in this way, I meant always build rapport. And that's kind of part of the first part of the formula Dave and I will talk about. Don't just answer the question. Don't consider Q&A as a boxing match back and forth or a tennis match. Think about taking a step as if you were dancing and leading the person asking you as your dance partner and making the flow happen. It's an opportunity for you to build rapport. So an opening question that thanks them, that paraphrases, that shows a connection is useful. And then inform beyond what your presentation has shared or dive deeper in questions they may have. In the newsletter, I talk about hyperlinking your slides or even having a landing Q&A page where you feed a lot of the audience the questions they should ask you. It works perfectly. It's like a Jeopardy board. I'll take market analysis for 500. So if you do not know how to hyperlink slides, look them up. It's a very effective way. Finally, inspire your audience and show them that you've got this, you're confident, you're prepared, and a lot of this comes from your body language. Before we get started with the types of sticky questions, Alexandra has a question that says, now, why should I recognize you as my manager? You're new. I have been here longer than you. You know nothing. So I'm wondering if Alexandra is asking this, if the manager is asking a question at the end of her presentation. And before I ask Dave for your approach, I would say always approach this with empathy. Think of how the manager is trying to navigate and probably intimidated himself or herself about you knowing so much more and holding that information. And you may answer in a way of saying, if I hear you correctly, you're asking this, and maybe trying to introduce it a little. Any thoughts on Alexandra's question, Dave?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point because the way I read it was that Alexandra might be a new manager who's been here a lot shorter time than the person who's reporting to her and maybe asking her a question. So one way to acknowledge that, Alexandra, could be to say, you're right. I've only been here 3 months. You've been here 10 years. But one of the things I learned at my previous company in a very similar situation was this. So you've acknowledged the question, right? You've connected. Then you're informing them and you're reminding them quite subtly, hey, I've done this before. This isn't my first rodeo, even though I've only been here 3 months. I was 15 years at my other job. So there's a lot going on in that slight acknowledgement and response and then continuing your answer there. It's a very good question, frankly. I'm sure that's one, Alexandria, that a lot of people have on their mind.
She clarified. She says the direct report is asking their manager. So there may be a little bit of I would say a little bit of a power play there a little. I'm assuming the manager hasn't been there, is newer to this. And again, the direct report, it depends on who else is in the room. I always kind of look at the power dynamics because you don't want to ask this and expose the manager of saying you don't know anything. I like your approach of how the manager can receive this. I would, if I was the manager, just to say, just to try to understand your question. Is this in this context or this context? Maybe you can clarify. That's right. So the hard thing with StreamYard is you can't see the back and forth that Alexandra said. Yes, correct. So thank you, Alexandra, for your question. And for all of you dealing with some of these, first of all, before we begin, anytime you answer a question, you can acknowledge the question. We talk about saying, I'm glad you asked this, or this is an important point. In the newsletter, I ask you not to address, especially in a larger group, someone's question as this is a great question. Because if you do that and you say that to the CFO, then when the CEO asks a question, his question better or her question better be great. So you will have to find yourself identifying and labeling questions. So think about how can you build rapport. In the newsletter, I share this is an important point, or I'm really glad you asked this. We found a video of the current, as of 2021, CEO of Walgreens, Rosalind Brewer. She's in an interview where she's asked a pretty pointed question, and I absolutely love how relaxed she is, how well her talking points are prepared, because that's another thing we'll talk about here. And when I say prepared, we'll talk a lot about preparation here today. So let's watch Rosalind in action. It's a very short clip as a great example.
CVS is right here and Walgreens is right there, and I could go to either one. Why should I go to Walgreens over CVS? I could pick either one. Why are you better than CVS?
So glad you asked me that question. I believe our customer experience model is stronger. I think that when you walk into a Walgreens store, you may not have this happen to you every time, but I think you get a nice greeting from our cashiers, and I think our pharmacists are second to none.
I love this. Absolutely. I hope everyone could hear that. Our pharmacists are second to none. Rosalind has her talking points, and as the CEO of Walmart, she probably is prepared to answer the question, how do you compare to CVS? And he comes straight out and asks that question. Any comments, Dave, on your end?
Yeah, I liked it too. I liked how she connected right away, which was really nice. I have two critiques, though, of this particular answer.
Sure.
Number one, I liked it, but I didn't like how she was leaning back. I always think that when you're answering, you want to be leaning forward and you want to be open. Anytime you're leaning back, it can tend to be physically leaning away from your answer. The other thing, and I think you had mentioned this when we were chatting the other day, is that a good example would have extended that answer. And when you extend your answer, you take a little bit of control of the situation. So she could have said, our pharmacists are second to none. For example, I was in the Santa Monica store a week and a half ago out of a yoga class, and I had to go get a prescription. And that little anecdote example extends control and also reinforces the messaging.
So if you watch that entire video forum, she does give an example about coming into a store incognito in yoga pants and noticing how some things needed more attention and sending that to her team. But I like what you said. Or she can say, for example, we are at the standard, above the standard of training hours for our pharmacists. So she can give a statistic that, just as I said in the newsletter, inform beyond the presentation you just did. I'm looking where everyone is coming from and thinking, you all may be doing a presentation and we need to know about this in the Q&A. Or you may enter a meeting and you've presented information in a past meeting or in an email, and you're just being peppered with the Q&A. Or you're just like these executives we just showed in an interview, and you get asked these questions. So whatever the context is, one thing Dave and I will say, you need to be prepared, right, Dave?
Absolutely. Preparing for the questions. If you're raising money, if you're a startup VC-backed company, you're going to get asked, what's your exit strategy? When are you going to be profitable? Who's on the board? Who's on the company? How are you any different from your biggest competitor? Those questions are coming. So you need to prepare your answers to each one of those questions, and following Tatiana's formula would be a great way to prep those.
Absolutely. We have a great example from an actor we love and have followed for years. Samuel Jackson gets asked if he watches himself and he learns, and does he use that to prepare? I wouldn't argue that we're all acting on a theater stage, but in a way, we are performing anytime we send a message. So Shelby, let's cue up our dear friend, Samuel.
Do you watch your movies?
Yes, I do.
You like seeing yourself on screen?
I do. I used to, when I was doing theater in New York, I always wanted to see the play I was in with me in it.
Hard to do.
Yeah, it is. Very difficult. So this was perfect for me. I get to watch my performances. I always think that, I can't stand to watch myself. It's like some bullshit. It's like, really? It's a watch me business. And if you can't watch it, why should people pay $13.50 to watch you do it?
It's a watch me business, right? So
Yeah.
all of you, if you're preparing for a presentation and a Q&A, have someone mock question, ask and answer for you, and record that as well if you want to be prepared. If you want to see this play out well and not very well, just watch Shark Tank. I'm a super fan of the show because they tend to put people up that have good ideas. They tend to put people up that have either a good presentation, a catchy one, it gets the sharks going. If you're coming in from another part of the world, the Lion's Den is an equivalent in the UK, and there's a similar one, I think, in Japan as well. Or you get to the point where they do very well nailing the presentation. They get to a Q&A and they are not at the level of their business to have proof of concept, and they get annihilated in television, which is really heartbreaking, but it shows and definitely demonstrates how this is important. Thoughts, Dave, on that?
Yeah, I love the Shark Tank, Lion's Den shows as well, because I think you have to have the business acumen and the strategy, but you also have the communications. And if you have one or the other, you're in serious trouble on a show like Shark Tank. And it goes to the preparation. Every single person on this LinkedIn Live has a phone, and that phone has a video capability. And if you go into a presentation like Shark Tank, or you're interviewing for a job and you haven't recorded your pitch and the answers to the 4 or 5 toughest questions on your phone and watched it, you're not ready.
Yeah, I don't know the statistics, the behind the scenes, but I think in Shark Tank, just like with the TED Talk, they get you to practice your pitch as much, but I don't think they line up the sharks and have you practice the Q&A. For sure, if you go on Shark Tank, talk to us, because you definitely need to know your audience. I would sit there and want to know exactly who is sitting there in those days and what types of questions they would ask. Neha asks us a practical question on part of the inspiration part of what are some good hand gestures to be followed during an interview? A presentation, and I'm guessing, Neha, it's elbows on the table. Dave, what would you think?
Yeah, the general rule of thumb, Neha, is that nothing gets crossed. So there's none of this. There's no touching the face, adjusting the glasses, hooking the
Don't
hair.
cross the midline.
None of that stuff. What you're doing is your palms are up, and in a Zoom like this, you have to remember the gestures will come right in front of your face, which is not what you would do in a normal thing. Normally you would do that, but of course you can't see that on a Zoom. So if you're going to gesture, you got to gesture up, palms up, open, and in sync with what you're saying. You don't want to try and force fit a gesture. In the United States tonight, there is a political debate. There's the first GOP candidates debate. I guarantee you at least 3 or 4 of those folks are going to have terrible hand gestures because they're going to try and force the hand gestures when they're talking instead of letting the talk track drive the hand gestures. And that's what you want to search for. Stay open and let what you're saying drive the gestures, and then it'll appear very natural.
Yeah. And if you are, Neha, on a camera like we are, stand farther away from it so that when you gesture, it's visible versus gesturing outside of the box, which seems and could be more distracting. Continue to send us your questions and some of the challenging situations, because that's the next phase or step that we're stepping into. We're covering, let me look at my notes, dumb questions, multi-part questions, tough questions, random questions, and finishing off with, drum roll, hostile questions. So a lot of those are sometimes supersized into one idiotic situation or a person that, I don't know if you've ever had the people, I have a question and their question involves a 3-minute monologue, which you can't figure out what they're asking. But hopefully they separate the questions, and let's start with dumb. So you know that you want to be open-minded, but you are also looking and questioning and going, where is this going? And before we address how to approach dumb questions, I can't help myself. Dave and I chose this, both voted it 100%. The former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, does a masterful job approaching a dumb question. Can we run that track? Because she is...
A lot of people will be wondering, are you two meeting just because, you're similar in age and, got a lot of, common stuff there, when you got into politics and stuff? Or can Kiwis actually expect to see more deals
So
between our two countries down the line? Because
My first question is, I wonder whether or not anyone ever asked Barack Obama and John Key if they met because they were of similar age. We, of course, have a higher proportion of men in politics. It's reality. Because two women meet, it's not simply because of their gender. Finland exports into New Zealand $199 million worth of exports. They have particular technology in companies like Nokia, biofuels, even basic industrial wares that we use in our buildings. You won't be aware that a large number of our elevators come out of Finland, agricultural machinery. New Zealand, on the other hand, is trading about $14 million worth, and it's mostly in wine and beef. There is huge potential between us. The EU FTA is a launch pad for that.
If you couldn't hear this video, I'm sorry, first of all. Sometimes we have technical glitches. We're going to put the link on the feed. It's a masterful demonstration of how to handle a dumb question. She actually answers the question with the question. So the question, she says, I have a question for you. Would you answer or ask this of a Barack Obama and relate? And because you're both female, you're both the similar age. The reporter said, because you and the Finn prime minister are female and similar age, what would you talk about? And she just nails it, right, Dave? Asks the question with a question and does sort of a, where are you going with this? Head tilt, head frown. Loved that. What else did she do well?
I was struck by what she didn't say. What she didn't say was that she didn't point a finger and say, that's a stupid sexist question, get out, right? Because that wouldn't have been very prime ministerial. But two things she did really well. Number one, she stayed level. She pointed out the obvious sexism in that question. And then notice how meticulous she was about the facts, about Nokia and wine and beef and elevators. She had all of those facts at her fingertips. So she was able to pivot very quickly from that's a really silly question to, of course, there's a lot of stuff that we've been talking about that's really important for both of our economies. So she kept it. She reminded me of the Michelle Obama, you know, when they go low, we go high. She kept it up here, whereas my temptation personally would have been to come over and wring the guy's neck. But again, that's why I'm not the prime minister of anything.
And she, again, doesn't become emotional about it. Possibly, as you said, behind the scenes, she could tell her staff, that's crazy. How could he ask such a dumb question? But she's on her feet and ready for that as well. If you get a dumb question, again, follow Jacinda's vibe and try not to show that disdain, but make a factual statement about that may not be something you would be asking everyone at this table. It depends on your position. Jai, hello. We've got so more people joining us from India. I would not send that if you're newer, if you are in a place possibly where your response could make the person at a higher position look further bad in front of others. However, a comment like this, I would probably point out as well. But as Dave said, don't focus on the fact the question was dumb. Focus on the question not having enough specifics and build your credibility with what you share. How else or what else, and have you all received dumb questions in your mind? The best place to be is to clarify the question again. It's as if when students ask me for a move from a B+ to an A- in an indirect way, I will say, so let me clarify, you're asking me to move your grade. And then I'll say, well, that sounds very direct, specifically. Sometimes when people hear what it is that they said, they may catch themselves. Dave, what do you think?
Yeah, I always frame it by turning it on me.
Yeah.
So let's say someone had asked me a dumb question and I say, so help me understand here. You're asking me about this and this and this, is that right?
Yeah.
So you give them an opportunity to restate it. And in doing so, frankly, you also get a couple of seconds to think, okay, what am I going to do here? Where am I going to take this? One trick that Tatiana and I always coach is to give that response. I want to make sure I give you the right information.
Yeah. What's in it?
Can you say a little bit more about this and this? And then Now, to the outside world, people think, oh, he's just thirsty. He's getting a drink. No, 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 no. In my head, I'm like, okay, what am I going to do? What am I going to do?
Yeah,
What am I
look
gonna
at the
do?
Rolodex. I'm dating myself. Like, where the heck is the answer here specifically? One thing I would recommend is the question may be coming at you, just see your emotional response. And that's where I think Jacinda's head tilt frown doesn't go beyond that, because she may be recorded and then you can see the headlines, Prime Minister comes unhinged, whatever opportunities are there to take someone down at a high level position like that. But that may be the same for you in a meeting, trying to keep a poker face, trying to keep cool. Poker face, if you don't know the term, is kind of staying pretty emotionally balanced and not demonstrate that as much. That would be my suggestion. If you know there are people, and maybe it's a dumb question to you, but back to what Neha or one of our earlier learners posted, maybe they literally are asking something they don't know because they haven't been there. So maybe there's truth to that, right, Dave?
Yeah. The other thing I would say is you consider your nonverbals. You saw Jacinda do one of these numbers where she was frowning and tilting her head. A tilted head or a lifted chin can be a tell, to use a poker term as well. You don't want to tell, oh, hey, I have a great hand, or, oh, no, I have a terrible hand. You want to stay pleasant, nodding, you're listening affirmatively to the question. You're not tilting one way or the other. You're not doing this. You're not doing one of these numbers. Like, what is this person asking me? So you stay within the box, you stay level, nodding, acknowledging question. Then there's a pause. Then you begin your answer. And you've thought about that as the question was coming in.
Yes to the pauses as well. It reminds me is, again, remember, you're not turning up the speed of speaking or responding. Forget the tennis match. Go more with the flow and a dance. Drink your water, take your pauses, take your time, and look as if you are very composed. When you get a multi-part question, these are the questions that the person asking, again, I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt. They may want to get everything out. Consider that sometimes the person asking the question is also doing a mini presentation in front of their bosses. There's politics and dynamics sometimes played out in Q&A. So they throw a bundle of 3 questions at once, and this and this and this. Dave, what do you do with that?
Quite simply, you pick the part that you want to answer and you answer that part. Because quite often, I remember years ago, I was in a room with an executive from a software company and a reporter from Fortune magazine. So Fortune magazine that's a pretty big publication. It was an important interview. And the guy made a show of pressing his recorder and putting it in the middle of the table, saying to the executive, okay, you're on camera, you're on audio. And then he asked a question. I'm not exaggerating. It was probably more than 5 minutes long. Yeah, but what about this? And I think this. And my wife was telling me the other day, it went on and on and on and on. And the executive was very well prepared, was sitting there and had the talking point that he wanted to deliver. When the reporter asked something about that, about software as a service, he said, well, one of the things you brought up was software as a service, which is really interesting. And then he pivoted right into his answer. So you got to be a little bit patient, even if it's a long-winded, ego-filled 20-part question. Pick the one you want to answer and start there. And chances are 90% of the people in the room will forget the other 19 parts of the question after you've got done talking.
My suggestion with teams, I do a lot with our MBA students, have prepared them for case competitions. And when there's more than one person sharing the presentation, here's your opportunity, if you're the speaker, to send part of that question. So you're not the main show. It's to say, I'm going to take this part of the question, but I'll let Dave address this part of the question. And Katie has prepared this part. So you're sharing in the love in a way, but giving everyone some speaking time with those multi-part questions, if possible. If you're in a virtual setting like this and you're speaking, I always like to say, well, let me make sure. So if they start with this, you can actually start, showing or trying to keep track, honestly, instead of doing it in your head, and try to maintain that eye contact too. That's a tool depending on where you are, if there's a table in front of you. If you're standing and doing a presentation, that's a little bit more difficult to do. Pranay is asking us, and maybe we're jumping into a different type of question. So we've gone from dumb questions to multi-part questions, and our next one is tough questions, and this leads right up to it. How can you be confident that you'll stick with us for a while? Because everyone else, you've switched companies so frequently. That's a pretty tough question, right?
Yeah, that is a very tough question. And, you know, it's a little difficult to be specific about it without knowing the
Of
details,
course,
but
yes.
certainly the acknowledgement, connecting, to remember the framework, right? Connect, inform, and inspire. When you connect and say, that's a perfectly legitimate question. I acknowledge I've been at other companies for 18 months to 2 years. What's different about this company is,
Yes.
so that pivot, as it's called, sometimes called a bridge, right? I'm taking you here, then we're going across the bridge and we're talking about what's different about this company, which is great because then you're lauding their company. That is something that I am incredibly interested in, and that is something I see as a long-term prospect. So
Or as Dave,
it's a subtle shift.
or Pranay, as Dave said, I recognize that you noted this on my resume. You may have noted what the value that this brings, however, in this situation is. So always think in any Q&A, what's in it for the person asking the question? You need to bring value to them. So to them, they may see you're pivoting from one company to the next as a disadvantage. You need to flip that and make that an advantage. And I would be surprised if you tell me that that question came out of the blue. You need to be thinking as your audience and be thinking of questions they may ask you. So Pranay, this is a question if I was your coach, I'd be drilling you on and making sure that you are prepared to answer, because that's a very legitimate question. Tough questions also are translated into no questions. Have you ever been in a presentation, you end with a lot of energy and you say, I know I've shared quite a lot here, and I'm sure maybe I didn't cover everything, and this would be a great time. I'm ready to field your questions. Crickets. Silence. What do you do then? Let's talk about the back pocket, Dave.
Yes, there's a couple of things to think about there. One of the things that can be really useful is as you conclude your presentation, let's say, the tell me about yourself question in an interview or your actual presentation, when you're coming to the end, you say, now I know we have about 10 minutes left for questions, and I'm happy to answer any question you can think of. But before we get to that, let me just give you the big message one more time. So what you did was you did a little signpost, you waved a little flag saying, hey, in a minute, I'm going to get you a chance to ask questions, but let me give you my big message one more time. And then there's much less chance of that pregnant pause at the end. Sometimes when speakers say, okay, that's it for me, questions, that's when it falls off a cliff and people are like, oh, wow, I wasn't ready to ask a question. And Tatiana, you mentioned the notion of that back pocket question. If you do get the pregnant pause, it can be really powerful to say, one thing that comes up a lot when we're talking about our company is this. And the answer there, of course, is this. So you have one in mind.
You're talking about the main point or the theme. I also recommend, if you have a landing page for Q&A, your Jeopardy board of additional information that is hyperlinked to appendix slides so they can ask you. I also recommend you use your tagline, your motto, whatever your main message is, that shouldn't be too long, one sentence. Put that in that landing page, because it's like a logo. You keep reminding them of what that is. And that is very, very helpful. After the tough questions and the silence, we're going to address, if I'm following this along, random questions. But Janello for us has a question. If you're not a native speaker, how do you politely ask someone to repeat the question, especially if they speak so fast or use idioms you don't understand? We didn't add this to our challenging ones, but this is, Jonello, this brings in such an important part. I have this happen quite a lot with people that I coach or our students. It's a legitimate issue. And this comes up reverse when I take students overseas and they're doing presentations, say in front of Greek executives, and in the Q&A, the executives ask a question and my students look at me like, please help, I don't, we have a signal. I would say to this quickly, always go back to what's in it for the person asking you. You can respond by saying, thank you so much for your question. I want to be sure that I understand it. Do you mind repeating it? English is not my first language. I want to make sure I give you the right answer. So it's okay to say, I don't understand it because English is not, a student would say that, but maybe you don't want to lose face as a professional by saying that. Or you may say, I had trouble with this that you said. Can you explain it? Dave, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think the idioms is a key point as well. I did have somebody I was coaching in Germany many, many years ago who said, we are going to evangelize this sport. And a German was sitting next to me and nudged me in the ribs and says, you should have them take that out because they're going to think they're talking about religion rather than evangelizing sport. You know, in America, they'll say, oh, well, who's on deck? A baseball term meaning who's the next batter up. But not a lot of people know that. So I think the idioms is also a big hurdle. And Tatiana, you know much more about that than I would. But I think it's what Tatiana advised is excellent, which is, can you clarify that for me? I just want to make sure I understand it so I give you the right answer. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's totally acceptable to do that in a Q&A situation, I would say.
Absolutely. We have, I'm getting a lot. Anna, by the way, hello. I love your posts. They are so always welcoming. Anna said, I've learned in the end of a presentation saying, now I'll take your questions. I like Dave's approach of recapturing. I want to remind you, maybe 20% of your audiences will wait for you to say, and now time for questions. Most of the people that I work with start with questions right at hello. They may say, I've seen your deck, I have questions. In the newsletter, I say, if you get 30 minutes, you better say, I'm going to present the main topic and some information for about 8 to 10 minutes and allotting more than 20 minutes for us to discuss questions. So you're signaling that you're not taking up the whole time, or you should be prepared to be interrupted from the get-go. It's okay. And that means the audience is interested and prepared. Sean shares, when facilitating, I like to ask for questions and then hold the space. However long for a pause is considered too long, that it becomes awkward silence. Am I perceived as a poor facilitator?
No, I don't think you are. I think it's great that you're asking for questions. One trick I quite often do is at the very beginning of a workshop or a presentation, whatever, is I'll say, well, I know you have questions about this topic. Let's get them out in the open so people yell out questions, and I'll literally write them on a flip chart or a whiteboard, and I'll leave it visible at the front of the room so it's right there, and then we will loop back to it later during the presentations. And frankly, I know what they're going to ask. I know what they're going to ask because I've been doing this for 15, 20 years, but they feel really heard. So I think, Sean, that's a great way that you're doing it. I would keep doing it and then keep them visible at the front of the room and then just make sure you loop back to them later. Nothing wrong with that. That's actually the mark of a good facilitator, I would argue.
And Sean, never underestimate the power of silence. Just like with pausing, it shows confidence. You're there and you say, I'd like to ask for questions, or does someone have, and you just get comfortable standing in front of the room, nodding, looking about. It's a time for your audience to think. And then you can say, as you're coming up with your questions, one that we usually get, the back pocket suggestion that Dave brought up. So it's more awkward for you than the audience. Nitin is asking something I've addressed in the newsletter. How do you deal with a question that's very important for the job role, but unfortunately you don't have the answer? Dave?
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's a very tough one because you're going to have like 9 out of 10, but what about that 10th question? So a couple of thoughts. Number one, saying I don't know is a tough thing for you to hear, to think about. But when you honestly say, you know, that's a really interesting point, I'm not sure I have the precise answer. Let me send you an email before the end of the day. Now, of course, that gets you off the hot seat right then, but you've got to get to the question and figure out the answer and email them by the end of the day. But there's a way to say, I don't know, without sounding like an unqualified candidate. You can say a lot of things there. We'll say, well, that's a really interesting point. And I know you're the area expert, the subject matter expert there. and I'm coming in fresh. But what I would say is this, because maybe you have a partial answer, and then you can also loop back and give them something by the end of the day. It's a tough one. It's a really tough one.
I always advise to not be afraid to say, I don't know, but always preface that saying, here's what we do know. So back to what Dave said, instead of saying, I don't know, I'll get back to you, to say, my research or preparation for this was based on this piece of data. Didn't get a chance to look at this, and you bring up a really good point. Let me find it and get back to you. So the quick response is important, but also to be sure to what's in it for them to wait is that. I'm going back to Janice's. We're getting a lot of questions, so I'm fielding these here. Janice, sorry, it's hard to see them in the feed when they move. As a leader, how do you answer the question? We have reported a particular issue and we haven't seen the behavior and the person change. What's being done about the issue? You as the leader know things are being addressed, but you also, that also things take time. What's the best way to answer? So to mirror a little bit of what we're saying, I hear you saying, Janice, you're trying to honor time that's taking, and you're trying to also be respectful of the person that is being discussed, but the person in question needs an answer now. Dave, did I give you a little bit of time to address it?
Yeah, this is a really tough one
paraphrased.
too. I'm not sure I have a good one. I haven't worked in HR for a while. I'd be the worst HR person in a while. But I think if you can say, look, I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. You want to see this change and it hasn't yet. We're working on it, and trust me, and let you and I have a coffee in a week or so, and we'll reconnect on this, because you're not going to be able to answer that in a room full of people. I assume there are some confidentialities involved here, and you're not going to discuss employee A's performance with employee B, C, and D in the room. So you may just have to stall. You may have to punt, to use an American football term there, an idiom, and then say that you'll reconvene later. Some questions there really aren't a good answer to. There's if you say you're going to make money in Q4 and you didn't, then it's not a good answer. There's no technique that we can get around that on, and HR might be one of those particular types of questions.
Absolutely, frankly. Yeah. Another one of those difficult things to deal with. What about the questions or statements that people usually pass? They sometimes contain two meanings. For instance, sometimes it seems like a compliment or it's a rough statement. How to tone a conversation? My recommendation would be to clarify. You're asking this so I can best address this. Remember, we went back with the dumb questions. Are you asking for this specifically? Or you can say, thank you so much for your compliment. Even though you know there's an indirect stab in the back, I would take the high road and say, I'm so glad you're bringing this up and thank you for the compliment. But to make sure that I answer your question, are you asking for this or that? Unpack that a little bit. It could be like a multi-part question, but I would try to unpack it in a very diplomatic way. Thoughts, Dave?
Yeah, the reality is some questions can be dumb, tough, hostile, multi-part, all at once. And that's very difficult to deal with. In this one, I like what you're saying in terms of they butter you up and then they stick a knife in you. So for example, this is a great company, but we're never going to catch our competitor. Right, so there's loaded language in there that it's very difficult to deal with. One of the flags I always use when I'm doing a media training, when we're getting someone ready to go talk to reporters, we'll try and load questions emotionally to get people to respond emotionally. And it sounds like this: oh, surely you'd acknowledge that you're never going to catch company X. Wouldn't you concede that your performance has been terrible? That kind of wouldn't you concede, surely you'd acknowledge, is trying to get an emotional response. And if you go back to Jacinda, even though that was kind of a dumb question, it could also be perceived as a little hostile. Just come with the facts. Come with the facts. Our market share has jumped 23% over the last 3 quarters, and what we think is this. So you stay above the fray, to Tatiana's point, and you come with the facts, and you maybe don't even acknowledge the buttering up, but you acknowledge the knife stab wound and you refute it with the facts.
So we jumped right into the tough questions, and we want to also be cognizant of your time. But it's true that practicing these tough questions will allow you not to let people see you sweat. we didn't address this piece at the end, and I cannot with clear conscience say, did that answer your question? Because I see more questions coming up here, and we won't have time, but we will go back in the feed and try to answer them. It's so important that you come across, remember, inspire confidence as you're answering those questions, and practice some of these tough questions, because that's the only way that you can come across as being prepared and being factual and emotionally matching the person where they are, and showing that this is seeing with interest and with attention and urgency in that way. In our time today, we try to give you a little bit of the formula, build rapport, show that you're listening, have a headline, just like our beginning, we showed you the Rosalind, the CEO of Walgreens, statement that you have facts and have additional information than what you shared in your presentation. Always close with a clarification. Did that answer your question? But as we say goodbye to you today, anytime I have a host on a live, I ask if there's one thing you want our viewers to remember or to practice well, Dave, what would that be as it relates to being a very good Q&A warrior?
One of the things about Q&A is that you got to get right to it. It's not a time to filibuster for 20 minutes. You've got to get to the nub of it, the headline, the nutshell. So instead of telling you about this, I think I'm going to show you a video. And it's an old video from The Daily Show. And in it, a woman named Jill Levine, who's the registrar in the state of California, is being interviewed by a journalist, but he's a comedian, of course. And what she does here, her construct of her answer is completely backwards. She doesn't give the nutshell, because what she does is go through a whole laundry list of stuff. So what happens is right at the end, he calls her on it, and it's pretty painful. Shelby, let's take a look.
In a nutshell, how would you describe the state of elections in California today?
We've got several big issues that are happening to us, such as the Secretary of State just decertified all our electronic voting equipment. We have several lawsuits against us for not having accessible units for the disabled. And we don't have enough manpower to actually man the polls for every election.
Great. Now could you take that long-ass answer and put it into a nutshell like I asked you to?
Basically, the elections right now in California are a mess.
Elections right now in California are a mess. There it is, right at the end. Put that at the beginning. Put that at the beginning.
And
Elections right now in California are a mess, and here's what we're doing.
And here's what we're doing for them. And let me tell you why. Depending on who you're talking to, if it's someone at a higher up, they're a mess. Here's how we're trying to address each of the three. I love this example. It catches all the viewers off guard, but it's such a good reminder, and a fantastic, brilliant close to our final message is be prepared, practice, be concise, and don't be afraid of it. Go out there and tackle Q&A and showcase your credibility. Dave, any other things to share?
No, I think you said it all. I think this thing is the secret sauce. Go practice on your phone and then watch it. It'll be painful, but it'll make you better.
Absolutely. If we didn't get to your question, we'll answer it at the after show online, but feel free to share this with anyone else. Thanks for taking the time and being here. Have a good rest of the evening or your day, wherever you're coming in from. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.